Black Op Radio presents 50 Reasons for 50 Years. Postscript, 1968. Now your host, Len Osanic.
Over the years, Black Op Radio has dedicated time to interviewing and archiving a wide range of people who have, with considerable effort, added information regarding the assassinations of the 1960s. We should not underestimate these contributions. To gain a better understanding of the big picture, these historians have approached the topic from many different perspectives. They reveal the consequences of these events over time. This series helps to reveal how the official story differs from the facts in each case. In conclusion, here is more invaluable information from the historians, such as author Jim DiEugenio.
You had the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. You had the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965. Then, in 1968, within the space of about 7 or 8 weeks, you had the assassinations of both King and Robert Kennedy. If you weren't there, it was so different than the political spectrum we have today. You had Malcolm X, who was an out-and-out radical. You had King, who was this brilliant redistribution of wealth and getting out of Vietnam. Then you had Robert Kennedy with his so-called nothing campaign. He used to call it that because his votes were the poor people, the minority groups, etc. Between the Kings and John F. Kennedy, essentially, the back of segregation was broken in the United States. After the last 2 assassinations, the murder of King and RFK, that's how we got Richard Nixon. And that's what completely changed the complexion of this country. I don't think there's anybody who was around back then who actually thinks that Nixon would have won that election. What would have happened in the United States if those 4 guys would have lived? You would have had a real reconstruction that we didn't have back at the end of the Civil War. You'd have had a real economic and sociological overturning of the system. But that wasn't allowed to happen because of those assassinations. And in fact, what you had was the opposite. The morale of the country got haywire. And then, of course, all the horrendous things that Nixon did while in office, the combination of Vietnam and Watergate, because Nixon was impeached, who became president? Good old Warren Commissioner Jerry Ford. Mr. Cover-Up guy in the Warren Commission becomes president. If you study the neoconservative movement in the United States, it began under Ford. There were a couple of young guys on Ford's staff who really didn't like the fact that Kissinger wanted more arms agreements. They didn't like the fact Nixon had visited China. They didn't like the fact Nixon had visited Moscow. They didn't like détente. And the names of these 2 men were Donald Rumsfeld and Richard Cheney. The big picture is, it was Bobby Kennedy's murder that brought on these lunatics. These are the same guys who are going to surface again in the Reagan administration, in the George Bush administration. And these are the same guys who are going to surface in W's administration and have brought this country so much grief. And it's all because of what happened to Bobby Kennedy that night at the Ambassador.
The researchers, historians, are the ones who locate and read the documents and can stitch together the evidence from various sources. In many ways, they have helped to change the consensus. Researchers such as Lisa Pease and Larry Hancock.
My other beef with historians and history is they think that history can be told and then set in stone, and it can't, because new information continues to surface in almost every aspect, and especially when you have something that's of a political nature or possibly covert or intelligence-related nature. Things are closely held, and secrets don't come out right away, but some of them do leak out later, and it's important that there be some sort of ongoing revisionism to account for that. And sometimes people lie on the record for historical purposes early in, and then those lies get repeated as if they are the truth. And it is up to historians to go back and revisit and question everything from the top. Because if they're lying about this, what else are we being lied to about? And that's why I pursue this. The world is not as presented. The world is usually quite different than it is presented to us. The real truths are not the ones that you're going to find on the front page of the New York Times, because it's not in the Times' financial interest always to go up against the national security state or Wall Street or important players on the world scene. It's very hard to get the truth about things that really matter. It's very easy to get the truth about who's winning, in the playoff game tonight. But when it comes to things of genuine, deep political significance, we're not necessarily going to get the truth from our mainstream sources.
To understand the MLK investigation and the political context, you've certainly got to understand Hoover's attitude and his actions against MLK. Hoover ordered his own people to filter the information off the investigation that was being given to the Justice Department. The Justice Department at least had some interest in some of the leads they were pursuing, and Hoover finessed them and made sure that when they got reports, they were very superficial, they didn't contain the more explosive stuff. The King assassination and the inquiry there shows how things can very well be controlled at the top, at headquarters. Because especially in the case of the FBI and the King investigation, all of the field office work was channeled up to a couple of Hoover's senior people. And the only people that made the judgments on what was going to happen with that investigative work were there at Hoover's quote-unquote seat of government. These were people that were in their jobs because of Hoover's orientation and are going to stay in their jobs that way. You can see how the calls are being made and how they close out the leads. They're just not going to do anything that's not going to be in the direction that Hoover wants.
Police records, FBI, CIA records should not be allowed to remain secret, especially not secret as long as they did in all these cases. If the RFK files, if the LAPD files, and the trial transcript, if that stuff had been made public like 1970, we would have solved this case and people would be in jail. That's how strong the evidence is. In a 5-year period, we lost John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. In 5 years, we lost 4 of the top voices for change on the left. And believe me, the rest of the left got the message. And no one has been as brave since.
Black Op Radio has also been a platform to hear from people who have played a direct role in these investigations. People such as Dr. Cyril Wecht and William Pepper, who can speak with authority on the topics.
Our government, they made a decision, the people in charge back then, that they were not going to get into the Kennedy assassinations. It would be too traumatic, too disruptive in our American political system. It would have led to a total opening of all the clandestine activities. It would have been, no holds barred if it ever came out that the government or government officials or ex-government officials were involved in the assassination of a president-to-be. And of course, that's what the assassination of Bobby Kennedy was about, just as the assassination of his brother 5 years before. They made a decision. This is best for the country. Even in the United States Congress then, with the House Select Committee on Assassinations established in 1977 to investigate the JFK and Dr. Martin Luther King assassinations, they concluded that most probably there was a conspiracy involved with John F. Kennedy. This is the United States Congress. This is a bipartisan committee of the top people. What was done? Not a damn thing was done. Well, if they weren't going to do anything and respond to a special congressional committee, then what are they going to do, the federal government, in response to anybody else, any other group? They don't have to do anything.
The magistrate, in his own report, admits that Sirhan was in front of Bob Kennedy, in front of him, proving our case that Sirhan could not possibly have shot Bob from the rear. The evidence is there. Anyone wants to see it, anyone wants to look at it, they can. We urge everyone to do that. The question is, how long will they be allowed to cover this up? Will it be covered up throughout all of history? That's really what the goal is. I worked for Bob Kennedy. I was the citizens chairman of Westchester County, New York, when he ran for the Senate. I didn't get involved lightly in this case, neither did I in the King case, because I knew Martin and was close to him the last year of his life. So these are kind of serious commitments. This is not the work of a loony conspiracy person. These two political assassinations have determined the course of history like no other in our lifetime, indeed perhaps in the history of this republic. And where we are today, in terms of the consolidation of the control of media and information, in terms of the militarization of police, in terms of the disparity between the wealthy, severely wealthy, and the poor people in our country, and in terms of the failing infrastructure and the breakdown of democracy in America. All of that has placed us in a worse situation than we were back in 1968, when these two potentially great leaders were alive. Political assassinations have existed throughout all of the history of human society. It's an ultimate tactic that is used when you cannot co-opt, compromise, or control in some way a leader or an emerging dissenting force. The ultimate way of stopping that individual, of course, is through assassination. In the 60s, we saw 4 of those. These assassinations in particular, one could view them as being preludes. What has emerged following the 60s through the 70s and up to the present time is the development of an oligarchic state in America.
It is quite a coup when you can murder political rivals, control the state to the point that there never is an honest investigation, and the guilty never stand trial. What does this mean for our society? Authors such as David Ratcliffe and James Douglas can expand the topic in a more philosophical direction.
John Kennedy was working to end the Cold War. Martin Luther King was working to really challenge the nation on Vietnam. Malcolm X was preparing to enter in through the UN a not civil rights, but looking at the human rights violations of a huge part of the populace of the United States. Robert Kennedy had been so changed by what he had lived through starting after November 22nd, 1963. Those people were tremendously vital in what they were willing to stand and die for. And it's very, very painful to look more deeply at what does it really mean that our culture basically has gone along with those murders.
The why of all of this is the critical question, just as in the case of the subtitle of the book, JFK and the Unspeakable, is why he died and why it matters. Well, why King died is because he had taken a stand against the Vietnam War and against poverty in the United States and the economic system over it that was considered unacceptable for a person of King's prominence and conscience and ability to get people together in resistance to outrageous policies. That's the key thing. And Martin Luther King had a vision for humanity, the beloved community of a just and peaceful global society. And he was prepared to move toward that, as he said in his CBC lectures in 1967, where he articulated his final vision. It was published as a book after his death, The Trumpet of Conscience. And he said he was hoping to bring whole cities to a halt, beginning with Washington, D.C., through massive, nonviolent civil disobedience until poverty could be eliminated from not only the United States but from other parts of the world, and war and injustice. He had a big vision. That was really the beginning of my investigation, the impact that King's assassination had on my life, and the recognition that his vision, a hopeful, a nonviolent, a redemptive vision for all of humanity, it went to the point where the powers that be were not going to allow it to be carried out. That's why we should be demanding that the truth be recognized and spoken.
There's a lot of incoherence and disassociated, psychotic, rampant unconsciousness afoot on Earth now. And as bad as it seems, as hopeless as it might seem, there is always the chance that any of us can make our own unique, special contributions, as William Pepper did in visiting Vietnam as a freelance journalist, writing what he did, what that spawned and engendered. There's no limit to the possibilities that all of us can summon from what we've been given in these lives, these incredibly mysterious and magical and utterly ineffable lives that we've been given to live here at this specific time. I just can't overemphasize the hope, as Jim Douglas would describe very much, the hope that we are still here and still alive and still struggling. That is hopeful. As difficult as it seems, we're still here, and we can still apply ourselves in ways that carry on the work of the peacemakers that preceded us.
Postscript 1968.